shit, Jester's finally making a Sekiro video. My apologies for the long wait to anyone who's ever commented wanting a Sekiro-focused video for the last year. But you see, it's pretty hard to come up with a compelling reason to make a Sekiro-focused video, because Sekiro is a fucking incredible game. Most people would agree that it's one of From's best titles, except my boy iBootyJuice, who couldn't beat the folding screen monkey fight. But most anyone else already has a pretty good idea of just how awesome and clean Sekiro plays and how perfect the game feels. To make a video pointing that out would kinda just be a collective glazing of a game that we all know is great, and it wouldn't be much more than that. And so it took me a long time to develop a more controversial and thought-provoking concept for this video, which will hopefully be a bit more mentally engaging than a good, simple, honest circle jerk, because it finally hit me. Sekiro is a nearly perfect game, more so than any other From title, and while I'll soon be going into great detail throughout all the reasons I believe that, the largest and most forward reason that Sekiro is a game that's mired in perfection is because of its most distinguishing feature: the deflection, appropriately named Perfect Deflections when fully mastered. Now, this system was a groundbreaking innovation and a huge departure from standard dodge roll style of gameplay seen in all other Souls games, and one that is as often praised as it is mirrored within modern Souls-like projects, which almost universally include a seemingly obligatory deflection mechanic. I mean, seriously, the last Souls-style product we've seen that hasn't included deflection was fucking Elden Ring, which was true until 2 years later when some intern was paid $5 to hastily mock up a physic tier that would produce a deflection of the same quality as the worst Souls-likes on the market. The bottom line is, despite many attempts to capture the same feeling that was born within Sekiro's perfection, there has never since been a game quite like Sekiro. And so the question I'll be attempting to answer by making this video is, why do other titles that include a similarly designed deflection system often fail so hard in their attempts to create a similarly perfect game? What qualities are necessary to make a deflection system work well? And ultimately, why are deflections both the best and worst system ever added to Souls? And to start, we'll need to take apart just why Sekiro acts as such a perfect game. The most simple and dismissive answer to that question is to point out that Sekiro is designed with a very narrowed focus, and remind ourselves that this is a game with a single weapon, a handful of unique skills, prosthetic abilities, and some basic default combat options. This is a pretty big departure from the standard Souls RPG idea of having many builds with a large variety of weapons and playstyles to choose from, and that results in one huge advantage over other Souls games. It refines the player's total combat options to a small selection of abilities, narrowing the total potential of responses to boss attacks and openings, which gave FromSoft a more accurate ability to refine the combat to fit the more restricted options. And before you come at me for saying that, let me explain that I mean more restricted options from the standpoint of the whole game, not within any one fight. For example, a DS3 boss has to offer openings that reflect basically every weapon in the entire game, and at least have one opening in their basic moveset which allows the largest, slowest weapon to deal damage. Otherwise, the weapon's sandbox gets somewhat marginalized by the boss abilities. And so every boss, in a way, is restricted to be designed with many weapons in mind, despite every fight only featuring a player with one weapon equipped. Whereas Sekiro limits the scope of your combat potential as a whole game, and therefore every boss is designed with nearly every combat option in the game in mind, and as the player you'll generally have access to every combat option in the game available to you at all times, with some minor restrictions such as the 3 prosthetic slots. Another way to look at this style of design and to dig a little deeper is to frame boss movesets by asking, is this move designed for the boss or with the player in mind? A move that's designed for the boss is aiming to bolster the boss's aura and threatening factor by offering a dangerous spectacle and a show of force. A couple perfect examples of boss moves designed with only the boss in mind is Millennia's Waterfowl, which gives her a massive reputation for being unforgiving and brutal, yet fails to offer a challenge that appropriately meshes with the player's abilities, resulting in a handful of somewhat awkward and immersion-breaking answers to the move. Arguably a move that would have worked well in Sekiro, ironically enough. And also on the opposite end of the spectrum of boss moves designed with only the boss in mind, we have Plesigisex's lightning stake attack. Which is a huge spectacle showing off his immense power, but fails to offer anything for the player to chew on because this attack is absurdly easy to avoid, and basically offers no way for the player to engage with the move, essentially creating a moment in the fight that functions like a cool cutscene. And that's it. Now, I do think that boss-focused moves are important for building an intense atmosphere, which builds up the boss to be something you'll be proud to have taken down. But I also think it's a shame when those moves come at the cost of player agency. Which brings me to the moves created with the players in mind, which will arguably be the most basic and boring moves, at least for the sake of me emphasizing their technical importance. These are the moves that allow the player to really flex their skills and combat options, maximizing their potential damage through whatever technique results in the most efficient means of taking down the boss. Often these are situations resulting from the most basic boss moves such as horizontal attacks, which could be potentially jumped over for a hit of damage, or vertical/thrusting attacks, which could be avoided through positioning, allowing you to start attacking earlier with a heavier attack. Or it could be a combo attack with different timings throughout, allowing players to weave in larger or smaller hits of damage depending on the speed of their weapon. Or if using a large weapon, for example, using a quick Ash of War in smaller openings for a variety of benefits. My point is that often the most basic moves offer the most engaging and interesting gameplay because it's up to the player to decide how they're going to use their kit to most efficiently flex on the boss. Whereas the pitfalls of most boss-focused moves is that they're often purposefully oppressive, yet inadvertently seem to only oppress the player's autonomy and engagement in the fight. Which is why moves like Waterfowl end up with a handful of cookie-cutter answers, which everyone will eventually just look up a tutorial for after getting frustrated enough. But hear me out, because boss moves don't just have to be with the boss in mind or the player in mind. There's occasionally a sweet spot where both aspects get appropriately addressed within a single move. My favorite example of this is within the foot stomp ground pound attacks of both Godfrey and the Crucible Knights. On a functional level, these lingering AoEs will act as a roll catch, and early on will instill a sense of fear in you that there's no escaping these bosses. Attempting to roll away from the threat will only serve to throw off your timing and feed into the tension you're feeling towards the boss, sexual or otherwise. And that's all stemming from a movement made with a single stomp, a single movement of a limb from these bosses that can have you feeling trapped and intimidated. The foot stomp Earth Shatter is absolutely designed with the boss in mind, granting those who use it a powerful and iconic move that's sure to stick in people's heads after being roll caught by it 50 times over. And after being hit by the move enough, the player will naturally have to face it down and begin to overcome its challenges by engaging with it. Firstly, by rolling through it, which grants a much more forgiving timing, especially so if your positioning is entirely past the attack by the time your iframes end. This is a powerful step in the learning process because it bolsters the engagement of the fight, keeping you in the heat of battle, dodging and weaving through attacks. And after a long while of getting comfortable with the boss's basic moveset, you might just reach the final stage of learning to deal with the Earth Shatter Stomp effectively, which is to jump over the stones and turn the tides on the move by returning a hit with a jump attack instead of just avoiding damage. This move is absolutely designed with the player in mind, and offers essentially a mini character arc for you in overcoming the fear of an oppressive boss move where there are many points of progress you'll make in understanding and eventually mastering the attack. This is hands down my favorite boss move in all of Elden Ring, and maybe all of Souls, especially so from a perspective of analysis. So many others fail in one category or the other by not being designed with the player's moveset in mind, either by just being a giant lump of random damage, or by being a flashy addition that only amounts to some extra emphasis on positioning, or a move that requires a more meta answer. It's easy to make a move just for the boss's sake, and it's easy to make moves only for the player's sake, which is why I appreciate the foot stomp so much in being a hugely rewarding, engaging, intimidating, and interesting move. Now let's take all of that boss moveset theory and apply it to Sekiro, which is a very simple thing to do because every single move in the entirety of every boss's moveset in Sekiro is designed with the player in mind. It is the bedrock of the core combat system, that everything has an answer to it, available to the player at almost all times, with the small exceptions of having to unlock Makiri counters and potentially some instances that greatly encourage you to use specific prosthetics. But even that is being pretty pedantic, because even the Makiri counter is optional, being that perilous thrust moves can be perfect deflected anyway. Which again highlights just how thoughtfully designed every attack is in Sekiro. The Makiri requires leveling up to acquire, and so there's systems put in place that you'll never have to feel unprepared for a fight. In the most real and poignant way that Souls has ever been, the answer to everything in Sekiro is really just to get good in a direct, meaningful, and non-meta way. On a fundamental level, the game was designed so that every move has an answer that fits within your character's more static build than previous games. And to me, it felt like Sekiro was this huge step in the evolution of FromSoft's formula, because the player-forward design made it incredibly satisfying to play. And that's largely why I get so disappointed when I see modern moves that fail to take the player into account in their design. Placidu 6's Lightning Stake isn't fun to play against. It's fun to watch, I guess, a couple of times. And Waterfowl is a funny little spectacle the first few dozen times you're hit with it, but if you're forced to look up a tutorial on how to metagame the move, then it's not an engaging player-forward move, it's just a meme. When it comes to Sekiro, even the most bullshit moves you could find within it are mostly just instances where there are small switch-ups in the formula which aren't necessarily telegraphed well, such as in the Snake Eyes fight, where this is the one perilous grab in the game that can and is expected to be deflected. This requires a perfect deflection, such as you can do on the perilous thrusts in the case that you don't have Makiri, but it's not what you would expect from a grab move, especially one that's positioned behind your head. Despite having questionable telegraphing and implementation, the move still has an answer. And I would also point to the Demon of Hatred's dash attack, which is considered a perilous sweeping attack that you can jump over and onto for bonus posture damage. Maybe it's just me, but it took me an embarrassing amount of time to realize that this was a sweep. Even so, it ended up being a move with a simple in-game answer that reflected the player's abilities appropriately. Now let's just take a step back for a minute to appreciate what it means for a Souls game to be designed in this way, with a specific, developer-intended method to avoid each and every move. And let's think about how that plays into the way that difficulty manifests itself when this design choice is utilized. Previously, it could be assumed that every other Souls game was designed in a much more piecework and generalized manner, with decisions made to reflect the idea that nearly all players would be frequently trading blows, dying, leveling health, utilizing shields, so on and so forth. The older Souls games expected that of you, and through these mechanics, developed a really strong skill floor. If you were to utilize everything at your disposal in, for example, a run of DS1, you would find the game to be a pretty well-balanced and satisfying challenge, even without learning much about boss movesets or having to react all that fast to their attacks, all while using your fully kindled Estus flask with hella charges to refill your health in a pinch. It's only after you look at the skill ceiling of DS1 that you really notice how sloppy the game feels, with most challenge runs metagaming through the most questionable of scenarios and utilizing huge damage increases to reduce the boss fights to a handful of necessary inputs, culminating in the final boss, Gwyn, requiring only 2 successful parries to drain his health bar and finish the run. Comparing that to the footage I have of a Demon Bell Great Shinobi Owl fight, where I did the Sekiro equivalent of a no-hit with all perfect deflections, and that fight required over 50 correct inputs just to beat his Phase 1, which was doable by even a fucking washed loser like myself, because the game was fundamentally built from the ground up to support an incredibly well-designed skill ceiling. Honestly, it's pretty ironic that DS1 massively popularized the phrase "get good" when it's only really designed to accommodate the most casual mechanics of modern Souls. On the flip side, I would argue that Sekiro's difficulty was designed from the top of the skill ceiling down, first establishing a basic level of combat abilities that the player would have access to, and then designing interesting boss movesets that work well specifically within that basic level of combat. And that basic level of combat is exponentially more advanced and complex than previous games had been. Up until Sekiro, your options for Souls combat essentially boil down to between 2 and 3 possible reactions at any given time. Being upfront, I'm just going to say that parrying is kind of an honorary mention in this category in any game before Elden Ring. Very few bosses were susceptible to parrying at all previously, and if they were, then parrying in a way becomes the default answer, because it's the most straightforward way to beat a boss, and in those cases your possible reactions range from 1 to 2 options. Either just parry the move, or dodge on the few unparryable moves. So for now, let's just discount parrying as a rare mechanic that only shifts the total meta of a game's balance in a small way. Next we have blocking damage, which again I feel like should be discounted, although this time I feel like people will get upset with me for saying that, which isn't my intention, so just let me explain. I have absolutely nothing against blocking from the perspective of players choosing to utilize the mechanic, just like I have nothing against anyone playing in any way they feel is most fun. If you like great shields, then I love them. If you like spirit summons, then I love them. And if you like rivers of blood, then go fuck yourself. Just kidding. The only ground I'll stand on when discrediting shield gameplay is when it comes from a perspective of analysis, because there's no way to get around the fact that shield gameplay is the skill floor of Souls games. A well-designed shield build with high health, stamina, guard resist, and a weapon that can attack through blocking makes you nearly invincible towards even the most ridiculous of boss fights. And so, what possible useful information can we gather about Souls combat when applied against the most one-size-fits-all answer to everything except grab moves? And I feel bad every time I'm criticizing an aspect of a boss fight and someone tries to refute my claim by mentioning that you can just block whatever it is I'm complaining about, because I really don't want to be the guy to tell someone that the way they are playing is irrelevant to the analysis of the game. But at the end of the day, it just is. And I'm sorry to be the one to tell you that, because the one thing a shield can't protect you from is the emotional damage that chips through when I say it's the easiest way to play. Just about every difficult boss move can be blocked, because blocking is the default answer a player will have when they lack the skill to avoid damage through other means. And that's all well and good, but just keep in mind that I'm saying that from the perspective of a player choosing to take the easier route, and not blocking being the only answer left against a poorly designed fight. Blocking was the default way that nearly all players used to defeat Dollar Store Radon after realizing that the devs failed to quality test the boss enough, and ended up leaving a now patched undodgeable move in his moveset for like 3 months. Anyway, back to my point. On a personal level, I generally discount blocking as a mechanic, because it doesn't offer all that much nuance to a thorough analysis of boss design. However, I will include it as an option here because we're talking about the sloppier older games where the skill floor is the main focus of the game. Which leaves us with blocking, dodging, and positioning as the 3 main reactions to avoid enemy attacks in older games. 3 actions that are somewhat interchangeable depending on the situation and player preference, one of which requiring specific equipment to effectively manage your damage taken. There isn't much about the older Souls games that can really throw you off all that hard, outside of poorly telegraphed bullshit moves, because you're only really focusing on doing one thing over and over again with good timing. If you're a block guy, you'll block and then unblock to get stamina back. If you're a dodge guy, you'll just dodge. And if you're utilizing good positioning, you'll generally be attacking while subverting the hitboxes of boss attacks. I wouldn't say that any of it is directly easy, but it's certainly straightforward and simple. Sekiro, on the other hand, cranks that shit up to 11 with the total possible reactions you're expected to be able to perform at a moment's notice, largely due to the fact that from the very start of the game, you're given everything you'll need to at least somewhat effectively deal with every attack in the game. Let's take Genichiro, for example, one of the best early game fights, especially for demonstrating all the different aspects of Sekiro's combat. and even more specifically for demonstrating the value of countering perilous attacks. Within Phase 1, Genichiro will almost exclusively rely on thrust attacks to fill out his perilous attack moveset, with the exception of a grab attack, which I don't see all that often, but can be easily spaced after recognizing his telegraph for it. The most unique implementation of his thrust attack within Phase 1 is that it will always trigger after he performs a large jumping slam. This, in a way, is a bait that's meant to set you up for failure later within Phase 2 after you've recognized the pattern, which is then switched up, adding a perilous sweep to the potential follow-ups to his jumping slam. That moment of realization is a great instance of Sekiro teaching you early on that it's not going to be hand-holding you through its bosses. You're going to have to react in a unique and immediate way according to the information directly in front of you, alongside the standard boss knowledge you've accumulated with experience. Another layer of complexity is added within the final boss version of Genichiro, where he adds another potential move after a jumping slam, this time being his larger combo ending slice, which feigns being a sweep, only without the perilous notification, and then ends up slicing upwards, which is meant to punish you for misreading the move as a jump. On top of that, if you were to deflect this false sweep attack, Genichiro then triggers a delayed perilous thrust counter attack. Another instance of Genichiro switching up his formula in a way that's meant to make him more oppressive and immersive is a punish for attempting to avoid his flurry combo. Ordinarily, your first instinct when facing down a flurry of attacks would be to space the attack and wait for it to end, hopefully in an opening. However, if too much distance is made between the two of you, Genichiro will cut his attack short and quickly fire an arrow at you. This leaves you with 3 unique responses to one single combo. Either fully engage with the move and learn the timing of 7 unique deflections, or space the move carefully, making sure to stay close enough to avoid the bow, or trigger the bow and then deflect or dodge the arrow. And this is a layer of boss complexity that we've never really seen before Sekiro. Not only do bosses have many unique attacks to throw at you, which require specific reactions to effectively avoid, but they'll also read your reactions and attempt to counter what you're doing in one way or another. For example, if you attempt to heal in Genichiro's fight, he'll likely use that time to charge up a high damage delayed bow attack, which works pretty well in my eyes to avoid Genichiro looking like a dumb NPC who would allow his enemy to heal right in front of him. This mechanic was likely the reason that Elden Ring has a ton of bosses who will also similarly punish you for healing, which many people misattribute to input reading because the punish window is often too close to heal and then avoid damage. I'm looking at you, Godskins. However, I for one praise the idea that a boss would react to the player backing away by sending a projectile at them. But I do think that there should be room for error in that mechanic, which works well within Genichiro because his bow waits for you to finish healing once before unleashing the attack, therefore being an effective counter to Estus chugging while still being fairly balanced towards the player. Now lastly, within the Genichiro fight, there's the ever so rarely utilized shock attack perilous moves, which have their own unique counter. That being the lightning reversal, performed by jumping and deflecting the attack mid-air, which charges your sword with that same electricity, which can then be returned back to its source by attacking before hitting the ground. Now, let's just tally up in total what this boss fight is not just offering you, but expecting you to utilize to effectively beat Genichiro. First, there's Deflections, including a large combo move for building posture damage quickly, and conversely, arrow barrages, which are best deflected, however don't deal posture damage to the boss. Then Makiri counters on mini thrust moves, then proper positioning in order to space his grab, then jumping to counter his sweeps, and finally jump deflecting and attacking to counter lightning attacks, all while offering the limited iframe dodge in a pinch. All of this is, at least to an extent, expected of you if you're fully engaged with the complete Sekiro combat sandbox, and I cannot emphasize that enough. It's not like the Radon example I used, where the single most effective answer to his broken move was to block, and so you'll just block through the entire fight because you might as well, since you're running a blocking build. Sekiro gives you near immediate and permanent access to every ability you'll need to tackle every challenge in the game, granted within your basic kit of abilities. And that's not to say that everyone is going to invest enough to counter every move in the game appropriately, which I can absolutely speak from experience on. Sekiro was, I believe, the second FromSoft game I had ever really played, and at the time, I wasn't even good at Souls yet. I spent my entire first playthrough of Sekiro using nearly nothing but spacing to deal with every attack. I don't think I deflected a single time, because I was bad at it, and instead found it easier to just wait for large attacks with damage openings to punish. Which is why the Guardian Ape fight was one of my favorite fights on my first playthrough, because it's mostly a damage dealing based fight. Even though in hindsight, I think it's certainly one of the worst fights in Sekiro, for not taking advantage of the many high skill mechanics that were on the table. And maybe this is a hot take, but I think the same of Demon of Hatred too, which feels pretty sloppy from the standpoint of Sekiro combat. That being said, I really hope to see them both reskinned in the upcoming Night Rain. I feel like they would shine a lot brighter within the Elden Ring sandbox. In fact, following this line of thought of big beast boss fights not really playing well within a deflection style of combat, and instead becoming decent fights through damage dealing strategies and utilizing more focus on dodging and positioning, reminds me of the idea I had to add value to the Bloodborne combat if they ever were to work on a sequel, which I mentioned within my Bloodborne video, so my apologies for repeating myself, but I do think it's a good idea, which was that Bloodborne should really lean into its distinction between hunter fights and beast fights, and then synergize that distinction within the trick weapon system. If Bloodborne were to have a sequel, I believe it should lean on the Sekiro formula, by having one single base weapon which plays the same for every fight, and would therefore allow FromSoft to, like they did with Sekiro, really fine-tune the hunter bosses to fight well against that single weapon. From there, the trick weapon system would fill the role of Sekiro's prosthetics by offering many customizable extended transformations to the weapon, which could be less focused on finesse and more towards dealing large hits of damage on the larger beast fight openings, created through the limb cripple system. I think if they were to design it with a lot of care, they could combine the strengths of both of these properties and potentially create something that outshines both of them. Just thought I would put that out there because I think Bloodborne's world and ideas have a lot of potential that I see as wasted within the single title. Anyway, back to Sekiro. The thing is, I don't believe that Sekiro ends up having the greatest skill floor in the world, despite having an incredible skill ceiling that was designed very carefully to expect great things from you by offering intense challenges that require many unique reactions from you to effectively beat them, which are perfectly balanced by giving you everything you need to perform those reactions at a base level. From there, every single thing in the game, except for the Demon Bell and Kuro's Charm debuffs, which are just straight difficulty increases, everything else is designed as layer upon layer of difficulty decreasing mechanics. Firstly, you have the Remembrances, which will increase your attack, and the Prayer Beads for increasing your health and posture. Obviously, these two upgrades will both give you an easier time, with attack increases reducing your necessary time to survive a boss fight, and posture and health upgrades giving you more allotted failures you'll be able to shake off before fully dying. This goes hand in hand with your healing and defensive items, which will find their utility increasing the larger your health bar is, including gourd seeds, medicine-related skills, pellets, rice, several of the sugars, divine grass, and I believe persimmons too give a healing effect. Now these items all add value to the game in the same way. They bolster the game further in the direction of the skill floor, offering more casual players the option to scour the game or grind in order to prepare for the challenges ahead. I would say that the inclusion of so many helpful items that casual players will find highly valuable really fleshes out the world of Sekiro to be worth exploring. I myself spent countless hours grinding items, money, and skill points on my first playthroughs of Sekiro, because I was absolutely dogshit for quite a while before I locked in. On the other side of things, for the damage increasing items, we also have the Complete Dragon Mask, which can be used to spend 5 skill points on a free Remembrance attack increase, Divine Confetti, which increases your damage by, I believe, 25% and also deals chip damage to blocking enemies, Handfuls of Ash, which can be used to give yourself a free opening for damage on most bosses, Snap Seeds to flex on the Corrupted Monk, and finally, the 2 damage increasing sugars, one of which halves your health bar for a time, which is just about the only item in the game that might give you a more difficult time, but at the same time the damage increase is pretty significant, especially when paired with Divine Confetti. The next layer of difficulty decreasing options given to the player would be the prosthetic tools, highlighted best by the Shinobi Firecrackers, one of the most useful prosthetic tools, for simply giving you an opening to deal damage on most bosses. But there's also the unique aspects of each of them that are worth learning and potentially worth upgrading to take advantage of their specific strengths, such as Firecrackers dealing extra posture damage to beasts, Shurikens dealing extra damage to mid-air enemies, armor stripping with Gyobu's spear, or ripping the centipede out of the headless ape's neck for bonus posture damage with the same spear. There's Mist Raven to avoid taking chip damage on lightning attacks, Fire Barrel dealing bonus damage to red-eyed enemies, sometimes igniting them for a damage opening, the upgraded Whistle for 3 openings on Demon of Hatred, poisoning specific enemies with Sabimaru, and just straight up blocking damage with the Iron Fortress. The list goes on and on, offering interesting ways to subvert the difficulty of the game, those difficulties themselves being well designed, but often not being worth a casual player wanting to invest hours of their life mastering every detail of. There's also, of course, the game's powerful combat arts, most prominently the Mortal Draw, which deals significant damage, while also dealing a large enough hit to knock many enemies out of the windups of their most powerful moves. All of this, the entire sandbox of upgrades, abilities, consumables, and prosthetics, are all reaching downwards from the immaculate skill ceiling of Sekiro, offering players of all skill levels the opportunity to play the game, get invested in it, enough so that they'll feel encouraged to begin climbing towards that skill ceiling. For me, I went from killing every single boss in the game with purely damage-based attacks, mostly through abusing the powerful abilities and items alongside a whole lot of running in circles. From there, I tried deflecting every once in a while, and then tried deflecting a lot more. And after that point, I was hooked. I began stripping away the layers of crutches I had been leaning on and found the real game beneath it all. I worked my way from the most embarrassing of skill-less gameplay to a point where I can perfect many of these fights with the Demon Bell active. Despite having a rough around the edges skill floor, the quality of the skill ceiling of Sekiro speaks for itself. And investing in Sekiro offers you a personal character arc of surmounting its challenges to see just how good you can get at a truly difficult game. And nothing highlights that more than the last mechanic I have to talk about, which lowers the game's difficulty: the Dragon's Blood Resurrection. I've wanted to talk about this for a long time because I've spent the last year shit-talking Lords of the Fallen, which includes a needless buffer life, which on paper seems like it should function similarly to the resurrections of Sekiro. However, the main thing to realize about a buffer life system is that it's fundamentally designed to make the game easier. It's a get-out-of-jail-free card, an admission that you weren't good enough to overcome the challenge, but we're gonna let it slide. And that's an incredible system in Sekiro for making the game more palatable to a larger group of people, allowing them to use it at first, and then hopefully eventually get good enough at the game that it no longer becomes necessary. Because Sekiro earns its fucking difficulty. It's developed from the ground up to be a difficult game. Lords of the Fallen, on the other hand, is simple and easy. It's designed to emulate the older Souls games, which featured well-designed skill floors, but sloppy simple bosses, and contrived situations forcing you to either metagame or risk being pushed off of a cliff or something. Lords has none of the complexity nor technical finesse of Sekiro, and instead attempts to inflate its difficulty enough so to justify its buffer life, by having bullshit one-shot moments and increasing the damage of their bosses enough to make their simple design even remotely threatening. Sekiro earned those buffer lives, because the base game expects you to eventually master it, and that skill ceiling is there waiting for you, complete with thoughtful, developer-intended answers to every single move in the entire game. I'm going to put that down as the first aspect that makes a deflection system great: moves designed with the player in mind, or deflectable moves designed to be deflected. I don't think there's any way to really ignore that one. If you've designed a game where players are meant to face down every single move, then it's basically inarguable that every move should have an answer appropriate of the abilities given to them. Now let's take a step back for a second, because I can already hear any potential Sekiro haters typing up a comment saying, yeah, obviously every move in Sekiro was designed with an answer, because deflections are the default answer to almost everything. And I get where you would be coming from if you were to be thinking that, because I absolutely think the same thing. when it comes to the knockoff games. One of the major reasons that Sekiro shines miles above many of the other deflection-style Souls games is because every single deflectable move was first and foremost designed with a deflection pattern of timings and not a repurposed version of an existing block feature. Blocking with your weapon has always been a mechanic in Souls, and has always been a pretty static one, which serves its basic function of reducing your damage taken. There's not a lot of visual information necessary when the purpose of the mechanic is so simple and niche, and it's understandable to keep things basic for the block feature. It would be quite the extra workload to design a ton of new animations onto every class of weapon in the entire game. Sekiro, on the other hand, has a single weapon which was overclocked with rewarding visual information surrounding its deflection system. For instance, the flurry-style moves, which in any other game would act as a large AoE of uninteresting damage that you'll only really deal with by spacing away from, making them boring garbage, become intense moments of timing mastery which allow you to quickly turn the tables on your enemy through the posture system. The cherry on top of these engagements is the incredibly satisfying way that your character's katana will seamlessly swing back and forth to meet every deflection. This extra layer of immersion is both quite nice to look at while playing, but is also an immediate and enticing telegraph to the player that they're supposed to engage with even the most absurd moves. One recent example that really highlighted the important distinction between a hastily put together blocking-based deflection and one crafted with care was within the Night Rain announcement trailer, where the deflection system utilized by a character within it was instantly recognizable as the Sekiro version, and not the Shadow of the Erdtree physic tier which was already in the game, notably by having smooth continuous animations and satisfying sparks to signify a perfect deflection, which I see as the two main ways in which a deflection system visually distinguishes itself from a standard rework block feature. I'll put that as the second key attribute that makes Sekiro's deflections great: well-designed visuals, which I would place in three subcategories. Firstly, deflection animations, which unfortunately and understandably is the first layer that many games will strip away, in order to facilitate a weapons pool rather than a single weapon. It's, in a way, kind of missing the point that many of these deflection animations don't actually look like they're deflecting the attack, and instead simply implement a one-size-fits-all block with far more rigid and awkward visuals, lacking the implied dexterity and skill that the character Sekiro exudes in his gameplay. The second subcategory I would lay out would be the successful perfect deflection telegraph, which can absolutely be the make or break of a game feeling like it's worth investing in skill-wise. I still to this day don't know if the Lords of the Fallen deflection has a delay before it can be activated again, or if I just been failing the timing on flurry moves. Specifically, the Light Reaper's flailing spinning combo, which has a god-awful telegraph on its own, with his 4 different weapons swinging all over the place, has had me so confused about how the game actually works and what the intentions behind its design could possibly be, that I eventually just gave up trying and instead spaced the move because I don't actually care all that much about being good at that game. Why would I take more time and energy to play the game than the devs used to make it? Lords of the Fallen has a pretty bad telegraph for its perfect deflections, which has been patched at some point over a year after its release, and which I don't care enough to take another look at, so I'll be going over the state it had been in for 12 times the amount of time that the game was actually relevant. Its faults come down to being too subtle visually and being unclear what attacks aren't deflectable or will deal chip damage through. And in total, most players will find that the deflection system in that game can largely be ignored. It's not systemically satisfying or reliable enough to invest in more so than a spare few single-hit moves that you're confident about, which is entirely disappointing when Sekiro set the bar so high from the very beginning, with flashy and rewarding sparks flying off of a perfect clash of swords, alongside an excellent audio cue that I will at least note is dulled on beast fight deflections, which is another reason that I find them to be lower quality, but I will also note that there are only 2 main important beast fights in the game, one of which is optional and one of which gets a fucking sword in his face too anyway. On top of giving the player clear visuals of their success after a perfect deflection, Sekiro also features its systemic perilous attacks, which, alongside giving variety to the gameplay, offers a visually satisfying warning that the incoming attack will either have to be perfect deflected or cannot be perfect deflected. This telegraphs to the player in a clear and straightforward way that the deflection system is working as intended, but your gameplay will have to switch up to avoid the next move. Again, this is piggybacking off of the concept that every move in Sekiro is designed with the player in mind. But for this point, I'm focusing on the visual design, which is also fucking goated. The last subcategory within visual design I put forth as important for a deflection system to function well would be a posture bar of some kind. Sekiro's posture bar is so important and somewhat complex despite its simple design that it will functionally replace the boss's health bar after you've reached a certain level of competency with the combat. It does so without invalidating the value of dealing damage entirely by building off of a boss's health bar through several intensities of posture threshold, indicated by the colors changing through the building or decreasing of the posture bar. Dealing damage to the boss lowers the amount of posture bar necessary to reach each threshold, and each threshold will reduce the posture drain that will take place in between combat. The synergy between the two gives a distinct aggression to the combat, making early damage on the boss more valuable and punishing indecision. Quite literally, hesitation is the feat. And this is all telegraphed to you through the design of the posture bar being flashy and in your face, enough so that you'll not even have to take your eyes off of the boss, instead getting the general idea of how well you're doing through your peripheral vision. Now those are roughly the visual elements that I consider important to make a deflection system shine. So let's move on to the final element, which goes hand in hand with the previous topic. Deflections have to offer tangible, worthwhile benefits to the player through mechanics outside of just avoiding damage. Now, at the time of Sekiro's release, the previous catalog of Souls games hadn't really strayed too far from the path of any of its mechanics so far. The biggest outliers in that would be Bloodborne's gun parries, which attempt to be something unique, but ultimately just landed on a parry system that was aesthetically different, but functionally very similar to what we had before, trading reliability for range. Also, Bloodborne had its trick weapon system, which again tried to be something new, but was only able to manifest itself as a paper-thin reskin of the two-handing function of any other Souls game, albeit with incredibly powerful transformation combo moves on specific weapons. With Sekiro, FromSoft doubled down harder than ever before on making a game that played in a completely different way than their previous titles, and through that decision had the immense task of making absolute certain that their new deflection system would be rewarding to players. A titanic effort of thoughtful design that I feel is criminally underappreciated and taken for granted, especially by the copycat titles, which frustratingly discount that effort and include a deflection system of their own within their games without the accompanying mechanics that make the system worthwhile. It's hard to even pinpoint where the rewards for engaging with deflections begin and end within Sekiro, because the entire game is built to facilitate that as its main gameplay function. I can at least say from experience that without deflecting, the game kinda sucks hot cock, and I only cared enough to play it further and get better at it because it's just cool at the end of the day. The fact is, Sekiro would have never worked if it didn't take great efforts to justify its new combat. If deflecting wasn't made many times more efficient and valuable than dodging and dealing damage, then very few people would care enough to invest in the higher skill ceiling that deflecting represents. If you were just as able to defeat bosses by wailing on them within openings as you would be through death blows, then those moments where a player takes some time to heal and watches their enemy's posture bar plummet in the meantime would absolutely dissuade the average player from utilizing the mechanic. It was only through having bosses that block and deflect your incoming attacks and feel nearly unstoppable without fully breaking their posture that the system makes itself known to be the key to your eventual success. And so it really fucking pisses me off to see so many modern Souls games take all of those carefully crafted decisions, all of the sacrifices made to the other standard Souls mechanics and sandboxes, each and every move in the game that were individually designed to be either deflected on or engaged with otherwise for the sake of diversity of reaction, and shit all over all of it by slopping out an undeserved, unrefined, and ultimately unsatisfying deflection system into their projects without even a second thought. Sekiro built the technical excellence of its combat brick by brick through the design of a game that basically had to be perfect for it to work at all. And with the unprecedented slew of trash Souls games that include a deflection mechanic as a one-size-fits-all bandage on their lack of design, rather than a system being held up by untold efforts of incredibly talented and dedicated developers, I fear that people will lump Sekiro in with the idea of deflection games, and forget just how revolutionary and thoughtfully designed it really was. And with that in mind, let's begin to look at the other Sekiro-like games, and see how they stack up against some of the criteria I've laid out thus far in the video. I'm roughly going to be going from worst to best, in my opinion, but also I'll probably forget one while writing this script, and probably won't care enough to rewrite anything. So let's begin with a rather unfortunate first entry, the worst instance of a deflection on the market, and somehow a FromSoft product. We have Shadow of the Erdtree's deflection physic. Now I think this is a really good jumping off point to work out as a baseline, because this is the most straightforward and unabashed version of a block feature pretending to be a deflection. I don't think anyone could disagree with that, because this physic only does two things different from standard blocking and guard counters. It prevents the damage on a perfect block on most attacks, and increases the damage of a guard counter attack. That's it. And it's honestly shocking how close this system is to many of the Souls-like fully fledged deflection systems turned out to be, because they're often lazily designed. First off, was Elden Ring designed to be deflected through? Obviously it was not, as very few bosses' movesets will work well to offer interesting deflection gameplay. Especially so when the main system of reward through this mechanic is just dealing pure damage in the form of powered-up guard counters, which can only be applied by blocking the hit just before a large enough opening. And in many cases, that attack is something fucking stupid, which obviously shouldn't be deflectable in a traditional way. Such as the footage I got here where I deflection blocked Nial's Ice Blast AoE, allowing a full guard counterattack on a move that was specifically designed as a proximity punish. In fact, a ton of AoE follow-ups become really valuable to block on because they often come immediately after a boss's big combo move, and usually end in an opening, which just serves to show how meaningless the deflections really are. They're least valuable within the sword clashing of a boss's regular moveset, which in turn can just be spaced or dodge rolled to avoid potential danger, and most valuable within weird metagame moments of only hitting the guard on specific moves that end in openings, none of which were designed specifically to be deflected. And the only mechanic in place that attempts to cover up for that is a stacking buff for each deflected attack, increasing the damage of your next guard counter. But again, nothing in the game was designed with this mechanic in mind, and so most often you'll just end up with a random passive increase to damage, because the buff ends up having very little synergy with the boss combat sandbox. Nothing highlights that more than Millennia, who will heal on each of your successful deflections, making it highly valuable to avoid doing so until the final hit before an opening, which kinda just makes her fight the exact same as a normal run, but with massive damage guard counter hits every so often. Next we have visuals, of which there are really none compared to just guard countering as normal. In fact, the guard counter sound is only signaled after you've activated the follow-up guard counter attack, so there's no real visual or audio information in relation to the actual deflection, outside of just watching the damage on your health bar. There's also no unique animations because it's just a block mechanic, and no posture bar of any kind because this is all based off of the existing block mechanics. Lastly, is there a system in place to make this guard counter build valuable other than just avoiding damage? I would say yes and no. Clearly, the deflections were meant to be a powerful option, and so it was over-designed to offer large strikes of damage, most notably by giving players access to the one single weapon with a guard counter-related ability, the Black Steel Greathammer, within the same starting area of the DLC, as you would get the deflecting hard tier. This weapon, alongside the physic tier and the guard counter talisman and whatever Ash of War you want to use, and several deflections in a row, can produce an insane amount of damage and stagger an enemy without much effort at all. And that's why I say yes and no to whether or not guard countering is valuable, because specifically within this build, the expected standard guard counter build, you're not only getting a large decrease to your damage taken if you were to miss a perfect deflection, but also a massive increase to your damage dealt, but also it's much easier to use than any combination of dodging, positioning, sprinting, and jumping, because like standard blocking gameplay, the guard deflection is pretty much the answer to most moves, including what should be tricky AoEs and moves that hit so hard that they knock you into a backflip animation, which, according to the wiki, gives you 2 charges of deflection building towards the damage of your next guard counter. I'm not saying it's not valuable, but I will say that it's not valuable as a deflection system. Deflections are meant to be a high skill mechanic that plays on the risk-reward of facing down attacks, and mastering their timings and mechanics for an eventual total win. And instead, this guard counter physic is closer to a boss cheese than a high skill mechanic. I would highlight this by comparing it to a standard Elden Ring parry, a mechanic that fucking already exists in the game before the DLC. Elden Ring parrying often requires 3 independent counters to specific parryable moves, while keeping a close eye on the potential other moves which will absolutely need to be avoided in other ways. These 3 parry responses will need to be input considerably faster than a block, and will therefore require much faster reflexes and more overall boss knowledge, all while any misinput will result in heavy damage on your character, considering you're likely using a small shield, as well as a massive hit to your stamina. And the cherry on top is that parrying doesn't deal damage, and the only mechanic you're aiming for is 1 single riposte of damage every 3 parries. Guard counters, on the other hand, can get a hit of damage for every blocked hit, and with the black steel you'll be hitting for a ton of stagger damage, which will likely get you a full stagger within 3 blocks anyway. And nearly every attack in the game is blockable, which works on non-parryable bosses as well. Bottom line is, guard counter deflections add value to the skill floor of the game in the same way that the old Azure Comet build did. It's a fun little gimmick, but it's far from a real deflection mechanic. Obviously, I'm being highly critical of a system that's arguably a novelty, designed by some dev in the 5 minutes that a boss was walking through the office, after which point he returned to his nap. But I hope you get where I'm coming from at this point, that a reworked block system just doesn't work the same as what should be a full game's deflection mechanic. And yet, there are a fair few more games I'll be talking about soon that implement a system similar to this, and pretend that it's something more without putting in the work. I'm going to be giving Shadow of the Erdtree's Deflections an arbitrary score of a D+. On to the next game, we have Inatria, The Last Song, a game that most of you probably have never heard of, and for good reason. Now, oddly enough, Inatria gets a lot of the little details right when it comes to its deflections, from having well-designed visuals, such as a posture bar, a clear indicator of successful perfect deflections, and high enough damage on a posture bar filling that it's at least somewhat reminiscent of a death blow, I guess. It even has an innovative aspect to its deflections that I don't believe I've seen anywhere else, which is, Inatria establishes a distinction between its weapons and the tool that your character uses to deflect attacks, the benefit of which is that they've left themselves the room to have fluid animations on successful deflections, while still implementing a large weapon pool. Unfortunately, leaving themselves the room to design fluid animations doesn't mean that they would actually take advantage of that. Inatria's animations are pretty terrible, and often very rigid, which is something that they've seemed to attempt to cover up with a ton of ambient visual effects, such as the big splurt of black goo alongside a blur effect that covers your character to signify a successful perfect deflection, which is kind of a weird, distracting choice when regular sparks would have worked fine. It also doesn't help matters that the deflections are facilitated by a stone embedded into your character's wrist guards. Like, I see what they were going for, and it's cool to attempt something new, but in practice, it just looks like the dude is blocking with his hand, and it has no weight to it. However, aesthetic stuff aside, the real issues of Inatria's deflections come down to far worse than surface-level issues. You see, the stone that's used here isn't a one-size-fits-all deflection tool, nor is it something that you upgrade to give yourself wider coverage of different moves. Instead, the stone is made a choice for you to make, to decide which set of enemy moves you would like to block, leaving you mostly out to dry against everything else in the game. This roughly comes down to either protecting you from physical moves or magic-based moves or status effects, and deciding on any one of them leaves you vulnerable to the rest, which becomes a huge problem when there are massive, unavoidable, multi-projectile attacks that will absolutely hit you if you don't deflect them, and will drain the fuck out of your health bar if you do without running the magic blocking stone. On the flip side, if you are running the magic stone, you might as well just not deflect anything else in the game, because the physical damage will chip through. On top of that, there are plenty of options to invest in other perks or abilities that will increase the boss's posture bars without deflecting, such as the one that does so by simply dodging near a boss. And that's without even having mentioned yet that dealing damage also increases the posture bar pretty effectively. This is absolutely the most confused deflection system that I know of. It does everything it needs to in order to facilitate a well-designed, valuable system, and then drops the ball entirely when it comes to the fundamentals. There's no reason to deflect much at all. It will also get a D+. Now for 2 honorable mentions. Firstly, Wo Long, a game that never really grabbed me. I haven't played all that much, so I won't be speaking with any authority when I say this, but that's a fucking dodge roll, right? I mean, the game specifically includes a guard input on a separate button, and the so-called deflection button also includes movement. So I don't know, just really seems like a more powerful dodge roll to me, especially considering the perilous moves of Wo Long are solved by dodging, which gives huge damage opportunities after dodging on them. So the dodge deflect seems to be the answer to just about every move in the game, but gives a flashy clashing of swords animation to seem like something is going on. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know the game well enough to say, but at face level, it's seemingly really basic and easy. The other honorable mention is Kazan the Last Berserker, which recently had its beta demo, and so I won't be speaking about it fully because it isn't even out yet. I did, however, feel like bringing it up for a small mention here, because the demo seems to be exactly what I've been talking about this whole video. The deflection of Kazan's demo is exactly the same sloppy reworked block feature we've seen in every shitty Souls-like since Sekiro's release. And while there's only 2 bosses in the demo to really base that on, the main final boss of the demo really proved to me that decent telegraphs wouldn't be a priority. This boss does a ton of spinning animations while attacking with fist weapons, throwing kicks in as well, and mixing up his combos quite a bit. A sloppy blur of somewhat subtle attacks doesn't really scream deflection-focused game, which is especially concerning when this is supposed to be the fight that makes you want to purchase the game after playing the demo. But like I said, this is a demo, and I could be well off base. Another thing that concerns me is how the posture break system works by combining posture with the enemy's stamina bar, which will drain as the boss throws attacks in your direction, which don't have to be deflected to really see that effect take place. Alongside that, dealing damage to the boss also drains their posture, so deflections don't really seem to be much of a priority at all. I imagine that you can just as effectively dodge through boss fights as deflect on them, perhaps even having an easier time, considering how fast the posture bar will refill at points where the boss isn't attacking or taking damage. If you were to miss some of your deflections and therefore require some time to heal, you'll basically have thrown your entire deflection effort in the trash, as that moment to heal will surely fill the boss's bar back to full, I imagine. I can't stress enough how this is just a baseline take after one playthrough of the demo, but I can't say I was even remotely impressed. This deflection system seems to be just as safe and boring as all the others that shit on Sekiro's legacy. Alright, back to the real list, we have Lords of the Fallen. And it's at this point that I really feel like I'm just going to be repeating myself over and over again. Just like I previously explained with Kazan, Lords never made an effort to make its deflections mean anything. You'll largely get the exact same value out of simple dodges as you would through deflections, being that straight damage will drain the boss's posture all the same. The deflections are awkward visually, don't chain together well, leaving them to be single instance inputs rather than requiring any sense of rhythm, and very few boss attacks were designed to play well against deflections at all. There isn't a single high-intensity moment that can be carefully managed through proper timing through the deflection system, because Lords is really trying to channel DS2 in its design, a sloppy old game with good build variety and RPG elements, but very simple, slow combat. Its deflection is best described as unnecessary and mostly ignorable. And it's a real shame that this game, incidentally, designed one of the best posture bars out of any of the other Souls-likes. I will absolutely give credit where it's due in that the simple, sleek, front and center without being distracting design of the enhanced focused point posture bar functions really well for what it is, and is the single innovation that Lords of the Fallen brings to the Soulsborne formula. I'll be giving Lords of the Fallen a rating of C, which might seem generous considering my overall dislike of the game, but I think C is more than fair, being that Lords of the Fallen is the most average, shitty Souls-like of them all. It copies everything from all of Souls except the refinement of the later titles, and maintains most of the frustrating aspects of the older games. If it was released in 2016, it probably would have looked like a good version of DS2. But in a post-Elden Ring world, it's just unremarkable slop when it manages to run without crashing. And it does itself a massive disservice by including a deflection at all. Why the fuck would you ever want me to compare your shit game to Sekiro? Now lastly, and on the opposite side of the spectrum of innovation and standing on your own merits, we have Lies of P. Lies is hands down the closest imitation of Sekiro that we have on the market, at least from a perspective of fast-paced, skill-based gameplay, and yet still manages to build its own identity in thoughtful and carefully crafted ways. First off, is there an answer to every attack in Lies of P? Was each attack designed with the player in mind? Now, I would answer with a hesitant yes, with the largest exception in my mind being the PvP-style fights that you'll come across throughout the game. Can you deflect all of their attacks? Yes, and they often have breakable weapons, so it would seem like you're encouraged to do so. But I would argue that these fights are placed as some of the least important in the game, often being optional or showing up in small pieces of the Brotherhood fights, which to me seems like they're not worth investing in fully, and not worth learning their mostly quick and tricky movesets. That being said, there's many options within Lies of P that allow you to efficiently subvert those aspects of the game if you're not invested enough in them. You can utilize many powerful consumables to deal tons of damage easily, or use the Perfection Grinder to temporarily give yourself perfect deflections on your blocks once per fight. Or use many different upgraded Legion arm tools to deal with any aspect of the game you'd rather not fully face down. In this way, Lies of P is also designed in the same way that Sekiro was, by first establishing a high-quality skill ceiling that plays on the player's base abilities, then adding many peripheral items and upgrades that make the game easier to get into for a larger audience. When it first came out, I beat a no leveling, no upgrading your weapon run of Lies, which is absolutely not something I would choose to do on just about any other Souls-like. And that all came down to just how well designed the game is on a base level. There was no doubt in my mind that with enough effort and time invested, I could beat the challenge without resorting to metagaming answers, because the game is polished to nearly the same degree as Sekiro. One of the interesting ways that Lies demonstrates that is through its answers to pairless attacks, where in this case these are attacks that must be deflected to avoid taking damage from them. This is a clever inversion of the Sekiro formula that Lies manages to facilitate by giving a potentially generous and valuable dodge if you were to upgrade it through the P organ. This develops a mindset within Lies where dodging is almost always an option on most attacks, and in many cases it's much easier than deflecting. However, if you were to attempt to avoid deflecting at all, then you would find yourself absolutely skill-checked at any moment a red attack was unleashed. Through this, Lies greatly encourages you to invest in its deflection system without necessarily forcing you to, especially when later on there's a ring that allows you to dodge red attacks anyway. But again, I would say these mechanics are the training wheels which allow more casual players to enjoy the game, to want to get better at it, and to want to deflect more and more the more invested they get in the game. Like I said, this game really channels that deeper design meta that Sekiro established in really intricate ways. It wants you to be good at it. It wants you to reach its skill ceiling. Onto visuals, the perfect deflection is clearly telegraphed both visually and audibly, and especially so within fights with breakable weapons, where perfect deflections show the boss's weapon taking damage building to its eventual break. Where Lies understandably falls short is within its deflection animations, where it's clearly much more of a block. And I don't necessarily think that that's that bad of a thing here. And maybe I'm just showing my favoritism here. Let me know what you think, but allow me to explain. Obviously, like I said earlier, designing many deflection animations onto many different weapons within games with weapon pools would be a huge workload. And Lies of P is a game with more potential weapons than any other Souls game through its weapon crafting system. There are something like over 800 potential weapon combos that you could utilize, and while many could share potential animations if the devs wanted to design them, I think that the workload would absolutely not be justified, especially considering the block is part of Lies of P's design. Each weapon blade has a guard stat, which will decrease damage taken on failed deflection timings. And that mechanic has also been outfitted with Bloodborne's rally system, allowing you to regain part of that lost health through successful deflections or damage dealt to the boss. In many ways, the deflection in Lies really isn't a deflection at all, and instead leans into the fact that it's a modified blocking feature, which many Souls-likes attempt to do in order to make a lazy system that piggybacks off of existing mechanics, yet ironically, Lies does this and still puts in all of the effort to create enemies with attacks that have been designed with the player in mind, attacks that were meant to be deflected, complete with interesting rhythm-based timings for combos and extra dangerous attacks that specifically must be deflected. The last visual would be the posture bar, which is another area that Lies unfortunately falls short in. While there is a specific number of successful deflections necessary to break enemy weapons, which can be slightly reduced with the P organ upgrades, it isn't telegraphed anywhere in the fight until the moment the weapon breaks. And the same could be said for the stagger critical system, which just shows up whenever you've deflected enough combined with dealing enough damage. Unfortunate, but not the biggest deal in the world, especially when the weapon breaks don't regenerate like a posture bar would. The last criteria to look at is, do the deflections in Lies offer more than simply avoiding damage? And for the most part I would answer yes. Deflections in Lies are considerably better at building posture than straight damage would be, but that's small potatoes compared to the main draw of this mechanic. The many breakable weapons throughout Lies are clear and prominent indicators and incentives to the player that they should be engaging with the deflection system to get the most out of high-skill gameplay. Much like a death blow saves you from dealing with a large part of many bosses' remaining health bars, the weapon breaking is an immersive way to signify that the tides of battle are turning greatly in your favor, and that you've finessed the boss to a point where you've gained a significant advantage, that often being a large decrease to the boss's damage and reach. This plays perfectly with the Estus Flask mechanic of Lies, where once drained of charges, you'll be able to regenerate one charge by dealing damage and perfect deflecting, so that breaking the boss's weapon will largely feel like a snowball effect that will eventually carry you to the final victory. Honestly, this system is a lot more interesting and engaging than the standard death blow mechanic of Sekiro, but it does come with its unfortunate limitations. There are not even close to enough bosses in Lies that effectively take advantage of the weapon breaking mechanic, and often there are alternative systems in place which seem to miss the mark of making the weapon breaking work at all. Laxasia's weapon break requires a ton of perfect deflections and simply results in a full Phase 1 victory, which boils down to a functional imitation of a death blow. However, through dealing damage on her openings, you'll likely find an easier time dealing with her Phase 1 in the traditional way, if running a reasonable build. And that's especially true when you realize that her Phase 2 retains retains full damage on her weapon, undermining the value of breaking her weapon at all. There's also the moments where bosses only have breakable weapons within their second phases, such as Romeo or the Archbishop, who fights with two sides, one whose moveset is completely different than Phase 1, and one that fights very similarly to Phase 1. So the weapon break doesn't find much value at all. One thing I certainly hope is explored further in Lies of P's eventual DLC is a deeper investment in the standard weapon breaks, which work really well, and less mix-ups of the formula that only really undermine the mechanic. But as a whole, I feel like Lies of P certainly earns its difficulty, and earns the right to be described as a rhythm-based deflection game that was clearly crafted with enough clever design, innovation, attention to detail, and understanding of its source material to definitively make its deflections work second best to Sekiro. In my opinion, it is the only game on the market that really comes close to mimicking Sekiro's gameplay, and it does so while bringing a ton of fresh ideas to the table. I'll absolutely give it an A with wiggle room for an A+, depending on how the DLC turns out. Now that wraps up all the Sekiro likes that I care to talk about in relation to how influential deflections have been in the recent years. And my only real takeaway is this: there has never been a game quite like Sekiro. A game that's built from the ground up on the ideals of perfection and expects you, the player, to someday reach that level of perfection it's laid out before you. And I'm really glad that I've picked this point in time to really take a deep dive into this game, because it reminded me exactly why I've had so much faith in FromSoft until recently. You see, a fair few people have called me out recently for being overly dramatic and negative towards FromSoft, because of my concern about their priorities for the future. And I can only assume that a good amount of these people have never played Sekiro or didn't like it. I've always had a very clear message about my opinions of FromSoft's work, and that is that FromSoft always improves their Souls formula, which began with the base template of sloppy, slow older games, then progressed through the refinement of Bloodborne and DS3, and then the combat was both cranked into overdrive, pace and difficulty-wise, and refined to a perfected form within Sekiro, which was then reworked back into the Souls template within the massive open world of Elden Ring, a game that returned to the dodge roll-based combat, yet retained jumping, crouching stealth, and found a middle ground between deflections and parrying, with Elden Ring's enhanced double and triple parrying. Every game in FromSoft's catalog brought fresh ideas, innovations, and refinement to the table, all the way through Elden Ring. And like I said much earlier, I really thought that one of those innovations was through Sekiro, in the form of boss movesets with developer-intended answers to every attack. And for the most part in Elden Ring, I believe that to be true, with some really disappointing exceptions. There's debate to be had that Estelle's meteors don't really have an answer other than dodge spamming, or that the god-devouring serpent's fire wave is undodgeable if triggered when far away from the boss. But by far the most pressing example is Millennia's Waterfowl, which I absolutely believe had no developer-intended method to avoid whatsoever, and was later solved through metagaming within the community. And while I criticize that, I can get over a single exception while still believing that From had maintained the experience gained through Sekiro's development. As a whole, I loved Elden Ring, and would point to bosses like Godfrey, Morgott, and Radagon, up into his Phase 3, as examples of intense bosses with developer-intended answers to their movesets. It wasn't until I fully came to terms with the mishandling of Promised Consort Radahn that my faith was shaken. A boss with an undodgeable move, no back punishes, moves best avoided by standing inside of his hologram form, jumpable moves with little to no utility when jumping, a god-awful camera paired with telegraphs obscured by the boss attacking within his base moveset without facing you, as well as a veil of femboy hair, and who could forget, 1,000 copy-pasted columns of light which offer nothing to the fight but an arbitrary emphasis on positioning on specific moves. A boss made to be metagamed. A boss without engaging answers to his moves, and above all else, a half-baked boss. And let me just tell you right now, I probably wouldn't have blinked an eye at this kind of a boss if he was created within the first refinement era of Souls. If PC Radahn was placed within Bloodborne or DS3, the same games with Ebritas's undodgeable dash or Osiris's untelegraphed dash, respectively, it would still be considered forgivable because, let's face it, Souls games started out with a large degree of jank to them, which was expected to be metagamed by the player. But the cold hard truth of the matter is, Shadow of the Erdtree was released in a post-Sekiro world, a time when we've seen just how refined From's content could be, a time when we already know what they're capable of, and we would be fools not to expect that to be the new standard. I do forget sometimes that many people have a hard time getting into Sekiro, and it certainly has a more niche fanbase than many other Souls titles, which to me explains why many people don't get where I'm coming from when I complain about the validity of single moves or the answers that players came up with to deal with them. Many people missed that section in From's history, where they refined the combat of a game to a point where it could be quite easily described as perfect. And making this video has really given me some perspective as to why I feel the apprehension I do towards the future of FromSoft. If the lessons that should have been learned through Sekiro's development could have been so easily forgotten in such a short amount of time, then who's to say that good hitboxes aren't the next thing to go? I mean, fuck it, right? Why design a boss at all when DS2 got away with 12 dudes in a church? And I'm sorry if that's not what you wanted to hear and I come off as a Debbie Downer, but I am absolutely being intellectually consistent with my takes. Shadow of the Erdtree and Millennia were a step downwards from the quality of Sekiro, which is a stark contrast to each and every other Souls game being better than the last. And I'd rather keep it real with you all rather than being a blind optimist, which does come with its own personal costs. Honestly, the negativity towards my negativity has been pretty draining. Call me a hypocrite for that if you wish. But I haven't really been all that invested in my YouTube channel lately due to many of the comments saying I fell off or something. I mean, I'm not like depressed about it or anything. I've just been spending less time writing video scripts and more time at the gym, or reading, or learning how to make sourdough bread. My Leachianus gecko laid a clutch of parthenogenically fertilized eggs, so that's all exciting. The one thing I've been slacking on is YouTube, because thinking about Souls kind of bums me out right now. I do, however, have the concept for a much more positive video series, which I will begin working on after releasing this. And I hope you like it, because I'll probably keep making it even if it doesn't do well, because it's really just an excuse to play some of my favorite 360 games. Also, I've been accepted into the Night Rain Network test coming up, so expect a video on that soon enough. So anyway, let's wrap this up, so I can begin working on all of that. What more is there to say about Sekiro? It was a one-of-a-kind game that managed to both create the mold and then break it, all within one humble title. We will undoubtedly see countless feckless Souls-likes in the future that will universally include a deflection mechanic without developing an identity for the mechanic, without even a moment of reflection on why Sekiro's deflections worked so well in the first place, nor realizing that a hastily reworked block feature which acts as a smokescreen on terrible boss design does not hold the slightest bit of weight or value when compared to a game built and polished from the top to bottom to facilitate a reliable, interesting, engaging, fast-paced, player-forward deflection system. A game about perfection.